Because it's time to start.
Is that the only reason?
That's a good reason to start. Well,
here.
welcome to the United Lodge of Theosophists. Tonight we have a most interesting and different subject. Isis Unveiled, and the subtitle is The Pitfalls of Theology. So, without a whole lot of further ado, we'll say something about the Lodge and Isis Unveiled, and a word or two about theology. And we will look at, in particular, Madame Blavatsky's second chapter to the second volume of Isis Unveiled. And we'll consider some issues that she discusses having to do with theology, having to do with the mysteries of initiation, having to do with what in the ancient world was known as occult science, and her take on its place in the modern world and how it's come down to us, and how it has been distorted by various, shall we say, aspects of organized religion. But first, let's put a little background, because it's important to place Isis Unveiled in a perspective of the Theosophical movement. The second object, well, let's go with the objects first, because the first object of the movement, and it has to do with our subject tonight, actually. The first object was the formation of a nucleus for a universal brotherhood of humanity, without any of the usual distinctions. Second object of the movement, and the purpose for the founding of the Theosophical Society, was the study of ancient and modern science, religion, and philosophy, and the demonstration of the importance of such study. And thirdly, to investigate the psychic powers latent in the human being and the powers of nature in general. These are really what HPB addresses in Isis Unveiled over and over and over again. Now, it's the work of the Lodge to keep the works of HPB and of William Q. Judge available for study and available for discussion, and we keep books, and that's when classes going and so forth, so to that end. But the overarching purpose of the entire movement is universal brotherhood. And our subject tonight, the pitfalls of theology, touches on this issue because it really does matter what theologies are out there. It matters what human beings pay attention to. And put it differently, our first principles matter. Plato is right. Ideas rule the world. And so the ideas that rule the ancient world, for example, are an entirely different set of thought processes, of assumptions, of tacitly held and explicitly stated ideas about the nature of human beings and about the nature of our world. Modern science and religion, in all fairness, deal with, as much possible, objective fact. And if you look at science, that's all science deals with. Now, religion, we would say, well, does it deal with objective fact? Well, yes and no. Because it deals with, mostly, when it does, Blavatsky is good at pointing this out, it deals with theologies. Those kinds of things that can be demonstrated about the world. It may be the religious world, but there's still facts about the world. And it's a lens through which the world is seen and a set of assumptions that are made about the nature of that world. Now, Isis Unveiled itself is divided into two great lenses, two approaches. First volume deals with science, and the second with theology. Now, what do we mean by theology? Well, various definitions, but basically having to do with some investigation into the nature of God. Well, first fundamental proposition in Theosophy. Blavatsky lays it out in the Secret Doctrine in no uncertain terms. An omnipresent, eternal, immutable principle upon which no speculation is possible. Why? Because it's not a thing. As is often pointed out by students here over the years, if you distill that idea, one might say, well, in Theosophy, God is a principle, not a person. So if God is a principle, how do you objectify it? How do you make a thing of it? The big pitfall of theology is it makes a thing of God. Come down to it, you materialize something which is essentially no thing, Ein Sof, the unknown, better yet, the unknowable, that, and it's whatever that principle is, it's always beyond whatever expression we can lay out. Whatever we say is insufficient. In fact, whatever we say is too much. We're better off doing as the ancient Greeks did in Athens. They're said to have had a statue to the unknown God. Much more philosophical and leads to fewer pitfalls, if you will, because it doesn't materialize something that is essentially non-material and, well, from our perspective, abstract and no thing. Because that principle, there is no perspective. It's beyond perspective. Perspective has to do with distance, location, definitions. Two examples she gives in the Secret Doctrine. Absolute abstract space and absolute abstract motion, of which what can we say, really? Space really represents, as she says, kind of abstract reality. Motion, abstract subjectivity. But again, do we see images springing up in our minds if we say things like that? No, because it's beyond that. Now, in the ancient world, and Blavatsky spends quite a bit of time in Isis Unveiled talking about what was once a universal set of ideas, a universal worldview, if you will. And when we say ancient world, really, we speak of a time prior to 500 AD is really the end of the ancient world. Historically, what? Well, the Roman Empire was coming apart. The mystery schools of Greece and Alexandria were closed by the late 5th century, early 6th century. The rise of Christianity was well underway. In fact, it had become, by the 4th century AD, the official religion of the Roman Empire. Obstacle, or shall we say, pitfall of theology number 2. You make a church. So, if pitfall number 1 was materialize something which is essentially spiritual and non-material, second pitfall is we turn it into the official way to think. And Blavatsky argues time and time and time again that official positions and lack of individual choice and ability to think for oneself, when those things happen and you have mandatory ideas, dogmas, then human beings suffer. She puts it very succinctly at one point in this chapter, and she says, "It is not alone for the esoteric philosophy that we fight, nor for any modern system of moral philosophy, but for the inalienable right of private judgment, and especially for the ennobling idea of a future life of activity and accountability." So, she's not arguing for any particular viewpoint, any particular dogma at this point in her presentation. She's arguing for, first of all, the ability of individuals to think for themselves. So, we have Pitfalls of Theology. The first one, the materialized deity. The second one, we make a church out of it. So let's go on kind of to the next object of the movement, and that is the study of ancient and modern science, religion, philosophy. And she's doing this throughout Isis Unveiled, and she encourages individuals to take up their own study of these ideas. But she gives us some tools, and this is where theosophy is so invaluable. In Isis, the tools are logic, reason, reference to the ancients, to peripherally sometimes to what we might generally call the occult tradition. In The Secret Doctrine, she lays it out much more specifically in terms, it begins with a certain set of principles. But in Isis, she's collecting information. She's collecting facts. She's going to the world, as she does so well in Isis and in her many, many articles that she wrote, and providing the evidence for this ancient teaching, providing the evidence that at one point in human history, there was a universal philosophy that was both science, religion, and philosophy. That at one time those three were aspects of one unified worldview. And that the worst enemy of it is the kind of sectarianism that produces the pitfalls that we've been discussing. So that second object then is an invitation to look at our own, at human history from a different kind of perspective. From a perspective of principles, from a perspective of a much longer timeline, from a perspective of a spiritual perspective, which eventually culminates in a whole set of ideas about what she calls in the key to theosophy, the reincarnating ego. Now, here's where responsibility comes in, because this is an essential part of that quest to discover and the quest to look outward as well as inward. Because what she introduces later in her writings, she's planting seeds for in Isis Unveiled. But she plants these seeds, such as what we just read, because this is the essential idea that somehow we need to start thinking of ourselves as not just the material that we see, the forms that we see, but as immortal beings. And that is a radical, life-changing, society-changing, civilization-changing kind of idea. Without it, we don't have a functioning, effective doctrine of karma. Without reincarnation, we have no really place to stand and make sense of all the craziness that goes on around us in the world. And we become vulnerable to theologies. So here's our third, if you will, pitfall of theology, because theologies, by definition, are sets of beliefs. And sets of beliefs define us before we even start. And if we're defined before we start, how do we think of ourselves as reincarnating egos? How do we think of ourselves as perpetual beings? How do we think of ourselves as karmic agents responsible for our own destinies? How do we follow up what she spends half of this next chapter will talk about? How do we follow up with any kind of idea of a spiritual life? Now we come to the third object of the movement, and that is the investigation of the inner nature of man and nature. Basically, that human beings have the capacity to understand not only themselves as spiritual reincarnating beings, but also to understand nature the same way, and she says this, the same way a key fits a lock. And she starts with Plato all throughout her presentation in Isis. But she takes the threefold nature of the human being as the key that unlocks the lock of nature. And each has threefold, fivefold, sevenfold nature. She doesn't lay it out in the same way in Isis Unveiled that she does later in, say, the Secret Doctrine, and it's most especially in the Key to Theosophy. But the elements are there for an understanding, to see how the ancients looked at the nature of the human being and nature, and she gives us hints as to how we might regard our own natures, so that if we are spiritual reincarnating beings, then there is also a rational metaphysics, an actual description of what that reincarnating being is. Because it's not just some vague set of theories that she happened to kind of borrow from this writer and that writer and kind of cooked up on her own. No. She's saying that these ideas have always been there. In fact, later on in Secret Doctrine, she says these ideas were impacted in the imperishable center of our nature. They are part of us, or put it a different way, they are us. The same way all of the lives of nature are us. The same way the creative hierarchies that she talks about of spiritual beings are also us. In the same way that the very earth we walk on, the water we drink, the air we breathe, the earth we take in terms of food and everything, all of this is us, just in a different form. Because everything in nature is interconnected. And here we might say, this is probably the third, I'm losing count on pitfalls of theology here, but yet another pitfall of nature, of theology, because it dissociates the human being from the rest of nature. So anytime we view ourselves as, well, in the words of the infamous preacher probably a couple of hundred years ago, poor miserable sinners. You don't hear that phrase too much anymore, I don't suppose, unless one spends a little time, as we did in Dallas, Texas. You hear that for a fair amount there. But if a human being is a poor, miserable sinner, how do they chart their own course? How do you think of yourself as a spiritual being? How does one weigh and evaluate competing theologies? How does one weigh the claims of science versus those of religion? What metric do we use? Where do we stand? If our fundamental conceptions of what we are fundamentally flawed, that's the pitfall of theology, because it's imposed from without. We haven't discovered it for ourselves. We haven't taken as universal brotherhood as a basis. We haven't examined of any other faith except the one we happen to grow up with. And we haven't had a good chance to understand ourselves as spiritual beings, Because we have no metaphysics and no rational understanding of anything except what we've been told. Or, worse, what we, in big quotes, believe. So there's yet another pitfall of theology: belief. And not just ordinary belief, as in, I believe the sun's coming up tomorrow morning. I've got a pretty good certainty about that one. Now, it doesn't really come up. We know that. At least we think we know it. The earth turns and all those kinds of things. But I still believe it. It's worked out pretty good for, quite a while, for me anyway. So it's probably true. And I'm willing to bet that tomorrow morning, in fact, I'll stake my life on it, the sun will come up tomorrow morning. Okay, that's a belief. But other kinds of beliefs, especially blind ones, about areas of ourselves or of nature or the world that we haven't yet fully had a chance to investigate, those can be a little dangerous too. Those can be pitfalls, especially if we take, Blavatsky was good at pointing out this kind of thing in ISIS, where if we're told that we have to believe certain kinds of things, we have to believe that there's a God and a devil and a bunch of other things that we haven't had a chance to investigate ourselves. What do we use for a metric? What do we use to understand what's valuable and what's not? So that's a start for this the second chapter to the second volume of ISIS. It's almost 2 chapters. It changes tone about midway through. And I would encourage anybody that wants to read a good section of ISIS to take a look at, it starts on page 55 of the second volume and goes to 122 or so, but read the last 20 pages. Start on page 99. Page 99 is a great place to start in volume 2. Here's what she says in that section, and then we'll say a little more about that area, and then we'll take a break for some questions before we move on. She says, what we desire to prove is that underlying every ancient popular religion was the same ancient wisdom doctrine, one and identical, professed and practiced by the initiates of every country, who alone were aware of its existence and importance. To ascertain its origin and the precise age in which it was matured is now beyond human possibility. I'm going to skip down a little bit. The proofs of this identity of fundamental doctrine in the old religions are found in the prevalence of a system of initiation, in the secret sacerdotal castes who had the guardianship of mystical words of power and a public display of a phenomenal control over natural forces. I'm not quite sure. It takes a while for that paragraph to sink in. Let's paraphrase it a little bit. What she's saying is that the evidence for a universal system of religion, philosophy, and science that was known to the ancient world, the evidence for that is found in a universal system of initiation. That meant that what she means is, and she goes to great lengths to document it, that in every country that's known, there were teachers and learners of these ancient ideas. That is really a profound thing to say, because now we can look at the evidence of it. And what she goes on to explain and goes to great lengths to lay out the difference between that viewpoint and the theologies of both East and West, but particularly the West. She lays out this whole system of thought that says that there is always the outer form the religions as they appear to us. And then within them, there is always a sacred science, without exception, in every country in the world. Now that's a pretty amazing thing to say. And then she gives examples from modern day India to show that the same thing was, at least in the 19th century, and we assume today, still true. She goes to the ancients, she goes to Plato and Pythagoras, to Plotinus and Porphyry, to Iamblichus and Proclus, to the ancient Egyptians, to the Greek mysteries. And she shows, for example, that in the Greek mysteries, there was always the public display, and were called the minor mysteries. And then beyond that, and within those minor mysteries, were the deeper sciences, or the deeper mysteries, taught only to the few. Now here's another thing she says, and it's pretty, we don't have it on the handout very much, but it's alluded to. She says that universally, the penalty for divulging the secrets of the sanctuary was always death. Pretty heavy stuff. Now, in modern times, she says, well, the Masons are the only ones that have anything close to that. And their penalties are very mild. You know, they only recommend that, you know, you be disemboweled or something. No, that's not quite true. But it's a pretty unnerving thing to read several times about how if someone said something that they weren't allowed to say, that the penalty was death. Now, is this a pitfall of theology? Or is this an example of just barbarism? Or is it some occult law that, well, I don't think we can, I haven't heard of many getting shot today for those kinds of things, but we don't know, because we don't have that. At least not, it's never been public, so it never will be. However, she gives an example, our friend Socrates, Plato's mouthpiece. The rumor on the street was Socrates was put to death because he introduced false gods, he corrupted the youth of Athens, and there was one other charge. I've forgotten what it was. It was just disrespectful to something or other. But anyway, it was charges like that. Those were the ostensible reasons why Socrates had to drink the hemlock. But she says, no, Socrates was in a sense a kind of a medium. And he divulged things he hadn't really learned. And therefore, he's our best example of, not done directly, but what happened to those that divulged mysteries that they weren't allowed to divulge. So certainly this question, we'll throw it out for some consideration in a moment, because it bears some discussion and perhaps a little speculation on our part as to how it was that such an extreme penalty was exacted in the ancient world. In modern times, we don't do that for except the very worst of penalties. You go and kill somebody, you might get the chair. But not usually. Most things we don't do, certainly to that extreme or that apparent extreme. Now, in this chapter, and we'll wrap up here real quickly, she talks about the adepts of India and compares them to the ancient adepts and shows how their methods, their doctrines, their principles, their lives, their asceticisms, their symbolisms, even their dress, all parallel each other. And in some cases, she shows how the Western churches adopted wholesale all the forms of the lesser mysteries. The dress of the popes, the dress of the clergy, the architecture, the design, the actual symbols, the nomenclature, the names, all of it was adopted wholesale. And this was our final pitfall of theology. And that is that once sacred ideas and ideals and symbols then become the outer garment of isms, of churches, of forms that at one time had deep spiritual meanings, but which later on just become borrowed and without credit. And that's part of Blavatsky's work with the second object, of showing how in ancient times what were once spiritual ideas and representative symbols became just another tool of control. Basically ways that people could be used and manipulated. Because without the ability to make one's own choices, then the institutions take over. And she does go to some length to show, earlier in this chapter, about how difficult it was from the time of, say, the 5th century to the 15th, during the Middle Ages, to have a spiritual idea without it being denigrated, especially in the West. So we're going to take a break. We've been talking way too long. And see if there are any questions, and we'll address some of the question marks I see over people's heads.
Did the Inquisition last 1,000 years?
No. Did the Inquisition last 1,000 years? No. Inquisition actually began formally in the 15th century, but in practical terms as early as the 10th or 11th century. It was a formal Inquisition institution in the 15th century.
Well, they were still burning people 200 years ago. Bruno got burned.
Well, 400 years ago. 1600.
Okay.
Formally, the Inquisition actually continued to the very early years of the 19th century. Was formally put to an end by Napoleon. But in terms of practicality, yeah. Well, because, the Inquisition is one thing, and suppression of thought and so forth is something else. But the Inquisition as a formal institution was effectively over by the 18th century. Yes.
In the Theosophical philosophy, we can read that death penalty is detrimental. Because what is gotten rid of is the physical vehicle, but the constitution is still there and can influence people in a negative way. So why would a mystery school founded on esoteric principle have a death penalty?
That is a mysterious question that we'd like the answer to. We perhaps can throw a couple of thoughts that direction. One is that it was very rarely imposed, although Blavatsky shows where it's discussed by a wide variety, a wide range of ancient philosophers, clear up to, her time. She quotes from an Indian text. That's very clear, the exact same, almost word for word, the same wording. But Socrates is the only example I know of where that was actually carried out. And it's interesting, the way it happened is that the mystery schools didn't have to do anything. The secular authorities, the archons of magistrates of Athens, took care of it. and they had their ostensible reasons. Blavatsky shows that it was really, there was an occult reason, which was the fact that Socrates was something of a medium. He followed what he called, and the Greeks called, his daimonion, or his demon. One could say that's, in one sense, a personification of his own higher self. One could also say it was, in terms, it could be some sort of elemental, a spirit guide of some sort. What in the East were called the Pitris, and Blavatsky talks about this quite a bit with regard to India, where the fakirs, the yogis, and so forth, often have their own spirit guide of a sort, but they're always under, in India at least, under the guidance of a teacher. There is always a guru that keeps them in balance. Now, in Socrates' case, he apparently followed his spirit guide a little too much. And since he liked to talk and ask questions, he divulged things he should not have. So the exact method, well, we're not really sure. But I have no final answer to your question. I'd like to hear others' thoughts on this one, because it's something of a puzzle. Colin.
What's the difference, or is there a difference? It seems from your talk that HPB is making a distinction between religious theology and ancient teaching or doctrine. So is there a difference between doctrine and dogma of theology?
Sure.
And then the other thing is, you brought up the idea of death of the initiate for divulging secrets. It seems a lot of, there's a few religions that death is still a penalty for not following the dogma. So what is the difference, and is there a limit?
Well, let's go with your second question first, because there may be a sense in which that death penalty is an allegory. There may be a sense in which it was taken literally. It's hard to know, because we have relatively few examples of it. But it might be regarded better allegorically, in that if one were a yogi of a certain type, and you went against your teacher, in effect, you cut yourself off. You cut yourself off from your own best nature, your own higher self, if you will. That's death. And in effect, you wasted that lifetime. So this may be the best, for some students, this would seem to be the best answer to the question, why in the ancient world was the death penalty, why was there a death penalty for divulging the secrets of the greater mysteries? So, now your first question, and I went past it. What would you?
Well, the first question was, what is there the difference, or is there, between ancient doctrine and religious dogma? Sure. Because that, in a sense, is a doctrine. If you were to become a Catholic Jesuit, you are taught a very specific doctrine, which the average Catholic doesn't really know or learn. Right.
Well, perhaps begin with a basic distinction, and that is any doctrine that's mandatory becomes a dogma. In fact, that's a working definition for dogma. It's mandatory doctrine. You have to believe. Once you have a liturgy, a list of things that one has to believe in order to belong, you have a dogma. And if you don't believe those things, you can't stay. As opposed to just about every ancient system, and certainly in modern theosophy, there's no requirement that you believe or adopt any particular set of of ideas. One could call oneself a theosophist. One could even be something of an occultist, a student of inner knowledge and a seeker for inner knowledge, and still not adopt a formal structure of ideas. One always has the freedom of individual choice. So that's the big difference. Theologies come about when religions become institutionalized, when there becomes an ism or an ology about a particular faith. The Latin word for religion, of course, comes from actually two Latin words, religare and religere. Religare means to bind back. So, for example, Mr. Judge points out, as to a common source. It's a good working definition of a true religion, that which binds us together to a common source. Religere means to hold together and to find the best practices, the best principles, the best ideas. So there's something more of an institutional approach to it. Okay? And in a sense, both are, one aspect of religion. Once it becomes institutionalized, you end up with a theology. That is a study of the deity or of God that goes with that particular set of beliefs, or it becomes that particular set of beliefs. So one could have an interest in theology and studying those ideas without having to make an institution of it, without making a religion of it. But it's more difficult. Yes?
Well, it's interesting how HPB frames the three fundamental propositions.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't say believe them or don't darken our door. However, she does make it clear that the ideas in them underlie all serious efforts to explain the universe. So she is pointing to a structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the paradox is the pitfall of the kind of literal theology is that it says there is this and believe it or don't, you're not part of the system. However, just to have anything be, HPB presents a very clear teaching, and how to remind ourselves that it is a real universe, there is a reality to it on different levels. So perhaps the pitfall comes when it's our personal nature that's only looking at outside form, instead of our inner nature looking at the abstract, what we really are. And that's a challenge for this particular time in human history, as much as anything else.
Well, one thing about theology is that people, the classic Christian theology would be, say, Thomas Aquinas, where he says certain things and he would put arguments against, and then he would put certain arguments as proof, and very often it involved references to the Bible and to a certain extent the Greek philosophers whose authority was not questioned. In the 19th century, people began to take a critical look at the Bible and recognize that many of the books were not written by their real authors, and it was not that good history, that we knew that the literal account of Genesis could not be true. Nowadays, theology is very likely to be a book that would explain what certain ideas mean in our time, or the time author's time and time. I mean, Tillich would talk about the idea of the fall would mean people's anxieties in life, facing the world as again away from essence. He would talk about and it becomes very abstract, and it moves from one extreme of this is what is true, and it's based on we believe this and that, to another where it simply does not deal with anything above a secular level, and I think the dogmatic theology basically, I mean, would look at things and say that this and this is true based on this and this. Prior to the 19th century, the Bible was the final authority. Today, after the 19th century, it became more looking at the modern world and just simply what does this book, what does these ideas mean in the context of a modern world? How does it relate? So that's how it developed.
Thank you. Very good.
Well, it seems like one of the pitfalls of theology also is that it becomes exclusive. There's an exclusiveness to it.
Sure, because then you have to believe not only a certain set of ideas, but then you have to be a certain person, or from a certain background, or do certain things, and it sets up walls because then you have us and everybody else. So once your fundamental idea is not unity, if it's not an ideal, say, of universal brotherhood, even something as simple as that, then it becomes divisive. It's us versus them. And you're right, we put up walls at that point. And so I think that kind of goes back to Colin's question as to how theologies work. Or Brian says they don't work. They're not discussing the real world. They're discussing the rationale for a worldview. And if anything, Theosophy encourages us to look at not just our own experience, but to use our own experience as that key to unlock greater nature. And so we use analogy and correspondence not as just rational mechanisms, but as useful tools to look at actually the way the world is, to examine premises and see what their conclusions are, to test, as she points out so many times, these ideas the same way the teachers that brought them over aeons have tested these ideas. So it becomes a practical kind of philosophy that you can actually examine. Come?
I'd like to go back to the idea of, you mentioned about how all the ancient initiate schools, the penalty for divulging information was death, and what that actually might mean. And one thing that's known, or what HPB talks about in ISIS, and then also in the secret doctrine, is that these schools developed mind and the nature principles of a human in a particularly quickened way. So you were going through a specific training. You mentioned that some of the Indian gurus, if you deviated, then you were, let's say, excommunicated from the guru. They worked in the sense that maybe a coach would regulate someone who's training. If you're training for a particular sport, the coach is going to recommend a certain training regimen, and if you're going past that, they know that if you train too hard or train too long or train too frequently, you're going to injure yourself as opposed to develop yourself. So there's certain guidelines that they help you progress in a particular way. And currently, I mean, if you're going to be an astronaut, they don't give you the flight training and then put you in a capsule. You have to go through a very particular physical development so that your physical nature can withstand the physical changes in your environment that you're going to have to deal with, weightlessness and how the body goes through that, all these different things. And it's known that the mystery schools talk about the occult side of nature, or the hidden side of nature, and the hidden forces, which most of us are somewhat protected from. naturally. But once you enter along that line of development, you are exposed to forces that you either can withstand or not withstand. So one of the aspects of penalty of death might be that you either develop in a way that's not balanced, or you're going against the principles of that type of schooling where the nature forces take over and have more influence on you. HPB talks in the transaction, she talks about different states of consciousness based on waking and dreaming, and the influence during the dream state, and that there are experiences that are chaotic and there's experiences that are premonitional, that we can see into the future in these dream states. But to participate in those states, you actually have to dream. You have to sleep.
Yeah.
You have to have a consciousness that transitions between the waking, the dreaming, and the waking, to have any kind of remembrance or cognition of that. But a deep aspect of that is that you either have to be able to put yourself into a self-induced trance, which is a deep sleep state, consciously induced by willpower, or you have to sleep. And so it would seem that there's a particular way that the mystery schools developed the states of consciousness of a student, which if you deviated from that, then you're open to the natural forces of nature, which if you're an electrician, there's certain guidelines that you learn. If you don't practice those, you can be electrocuted. And something as basic as working on an electrical socket that's alive, you can't turn a circuit breaker on. If you put one hand in your pocket, chances of getting electrocuted are pretty slim, because you have to touch both poles. Now, if you don't know that, chances of getting shocked or electrocuted are pretty high. And so that might be another way to look at how this death penalty, by going against, say, the requisitions or the requisites of the school of training, might be imposed. It might have nothing to do with outside forces inflecting on the student as much as inner nature overpowering the student.
You also have the problem of cults where a teacher abuses his or her authority to basically say that, I mean, there's one cult leader who basically told followers, you will have 100 lifetimes of bad karma because you insulted me, or something to that effect, that you must be, that this person is the most important. And where does the line get drawn where the spiritual teacher becomes an abuser of power, who basically uses their authority to control people and threatens people with lifetimes of bad karma unless they obey them, and so on? Where does that line get drawn? Because that is a very, very thin line, and it's very dangerous when that line gets crossed. And every time people get caught up with teachers and they find themselves in that situation.
Well, you bring up a good point, but let's finish Colin's thought here, because we'll come back to this idea of abusing positions of authority. It really goes back to the same issue we just touched on briefly earlier. You may have not been here yet. We talked about the abuses of institutions and the abuses of religions per se, of authority. But I think, Colin, you've hit a very good point here. An analogy of the electrician or the astronaut is very apt, because there, if you will, the executioner is not some arbitrary school or leader or guru or whatever, but it's nature itself. And one has in fact put one's finger in a light socket with 220 volt, and you stopped yourself pretty much. Or you set things in motion in society, as in Socrates' case, where society found reason to get rid of him, and there was plenty of reason for them not to like him. He challenged every preconception that they had, every assumption that they had. So, in a sense, he was put to death for that, but what was it? It was something in society that went awry, and his own nature was vulnerable to it because of his choices, the things that he did, and who he was. But I think it's really a very valid point. And so far, it would seem like maybe the best answer to your question, about how do we understand this idea of the penalty of death for divulging the secrets of the sanctuary. We had some other hands. Kelly, and we'll come back to Brian's question and Jerome too. Go ahead, Kelly.
Were most of the archons caught up in double ignorance?
Were the archons? All right. So by archons, archon was a particular name of the magistrates of Athens and the administrators of the mystery schools. So were they caught up in double ignorance? Well, perhaps. Who knows? It has to be an individual question. Those that ran the mystery schools did a pretty good job. As later philosophers said, for 1,000 years. And HPV indicates that there was that 1,000-year period of relative light from the time of Pythagoras in the 6th century BC to the closing of the mystery schools and perhaps Proclus in the 5th century AD, certainly the death of Hypatia in the 5th century. So that 1,000-year period was our last look at this kind of sort of openly acknowledged existence of this kind of school outside of the East. But who knows about individual archons? That's hard to say. Wait, let's see. Kelly, yes, I'm sorry.
Well, it brings up another point of theology and advocating vicarious atonement as opposed to the school of Theosophy, which teaches us that we're the weavers of our own webs and we create our own karma.
Absolutely, and perhaps this should be at the top, number 1 or number 2 of the pitfalls of theology, and that is that somebody else can learn for us, somebody else can save us. And I think it's the complementary misconception or false idea of what you've just alluded to about the abuses of authority. Because once we turn over our choices, once we put our salvation, if we use the religious term, in someone else's hands, or a personal God, or whomever, or an authority, somebody that we say, well, he's our guru, and we're going to do everything he says. And that's the pitfall that's being alluded to here. Then yes, we abrogate our own responsibilities, and that institution now takes over. And then those that don't toe the line or follow the certain ology, whatever it might be, those are the ones that becomes very convenient to put to the flame, or the rack, or in some other way, control the behavior of the masses that way. Please.
HPV starts the poison of silence in a very unusual way.
Mm-hmm.
She starts with a warning that these instructions are for those ignorant of the dangers of the lower giddy. So you think of the lower forces of nature as those electromagnetic congealing forces. And she also comments, that by the time Christianity came along, the mystery schools had already inwardly ended, even though outwardly they still were operating, and obviously brought a great deal of comfort and solace and importance to individual lives. But thinking about the way in which, as Krishna says in the Gita, over time, the mighty art is lost, just because, again, there's that congealing, ending quality to anything that's in the world. So from that perspective, theology or an inner teaching may start out fresh and alive, but then humans do what humans always do. Oh, we'll build a temple. Oh, somebody has to maintain it, or there has to be money. Without seeing the elemental forces that go with that kind of activity. Now, you could have a mystery school in which those things were protected against. And perhaps there are such schools out there in the world that are invisible efforts. So it's, I think, a reminder to kind of humble everybody that we all have our own kind of inner mystery school essence, but we ourselves cover up the truth from ourselves. So it's not just, oh, those ancient Greeks that went wrong. Not that anybody's saying that, but we tend to, kind of materialize it because we're fascinated by the process. So you then bring it back to what a real part of ourself would be needing to do to watch out, so there wouldn't be the abuse of power, or the concentration on personal ambition, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And I think that's what HPB is pointing us to.
Right. I mean, she's essentially says with the objects of the movement, you start with as universal principles as you can. Universal brotherhood, good place to start. Then she says, look and see where those principles have been applied before. Learn from the world. And then she says, apply those to yourself. But she says, nowhere in those objects is there, go ahead and form a church or an ology or any kind of institution. So what she does is go out and discover. And if necessary, meet with others that are willing to discover. And that refreshes and revives and starts anew that whole process, which, as you say, according to Krishna, the mighty art eventually is lost. No matter what happens, it's the nature of ideas and human efforts to concretize themselves. Maybe it has to do with just the nature of involution, is that consciousness takes on forms, and consciousness needs forms. But then we outgrow the forms, and we make the forms more important than the experience or than the learning.
Well, it was along the same lines, actually, because I was thinking that the word dogma has got a bad rap, because all it means is a set of teachings. And when we come to study theosophy, we become quite aware that there is a certain, set of teachings in theosophy that are quite specific. But how do we then stop the dogma from becoming dogmatic?
Well, let's go back to what we used as a working definition for dogma. Mandatory doctrine. If you have to believe, it's mandatory to be here, to explore, to ask questions, to learn, then those are dogmas. No matter how spiritual sounding the ideas might be. If we said, for example, you have to believe in reincarnation in a certain way, and we prescribe what that way is and what ideas you have to believe and what ideas you can't believe, all of a sudden we put a spiritual idea in our own convenient little box, and we use that to go around and kind of form fit that around everybody's idea, everybody's conception. Has to fit in there. That becomes our dogma. How quickly this would devolve into a church. Almost by definition, it's become a church. It's become worse than a theology. It's become some kind of a theocracy, where the believers, now run the show because here's a certain belief.
Well, being the advocate of the devil here,
there
are quite specific.
We haven't touched on the devil yet tonight.
There is quite specific teachings in theosophy about what reincarnates and very intricate such. So
none of it mandatory.
No.
And
so that is the point.
I really think that really is the point, because systems of ideas are just that. They're sets of relationships that show cause and effect, that show analogy and correspondence, that give us ways to look at, they give us a new set of lenses, if you will, a different kind of tool. But anytime you have to use those analogies, those lenses, those tools, they become, in effect, a kind of a set of dogmas. And if they're mandatory, again, no matter how spiritual, we corrupt it. And the history, frankly, the history of the Theosophical movement has done exactly that. There's a place, she says, we need no church of Plato or Pythagoras or Swedenborg or anybody else. But, you know, there have been groups of Theosophists within the last 150 years that did virtually that. Because, as she says in the Key to Theosophy, that they tried to make Theosophy run on the theological track. The Theosophical engine, they wanted to make it run on the theological track. So using an analogy of the steam locomotive of her day, using something not designed to run on that track, and you're going to make it run on that track. And there you get it.
Somebody else?
Yes, go ahead.
Because I was thinking, the paradox, though, because it's just been pointed out, there are actual teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're thinking everything is sort of fuzzy and hazy, then you miss the point of what HPB is saying. You might say from a theosophically scientific perspective, because there is an actual description that she gives of the inner and outer universe. So looking at theology as that which holds us from thinking for ourselves reminds us that she calls the ST the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. So they're ways of thought rather than content. But the content comes out of the thinking.
Right.
Instead of vice versa.
And part of the content for us as students is our thinking. We're part of that process. The same way that she says that in the Secret Doctrine, that ancient wisdom was tested, verified, and examined, if you will, scientifically by generations of seers they spent lifetimes working, investigating nature. Well, part of that investigation goes on. It's us. We're the ones that prove it. That keeps it alive. It keeps it vital. It keeps us connected to it, so that it's not just, this isn't just some hoary set of ideas from the past that were valuable a couple thousand years ago or 100 years ago, but these are vital, living ideas that we have to take and use and literally infuse with life every single day. If we do that, we'll have no dogmatism and we'll have no theology. What we'll have is a living set of ideas that take us someplace. They take us into our own nature and are shareable with the world. For those that want them, it's always available. And just like in the ancient world, there are always the outer forms, if you will, the lesser mysteries, and there are always the greater mysteries. There is always a deeper side to nature. Do we tell a child when they find out about firecrackers and they want to play with firecrackers? Do we just let them, start playing with them at 4 years old in matches? Not if you want to keep all the fingers intact. No, but at some point, you have to let them kind of go experiment with the fireworks, or you have to, go take the panel off the electric box. And you're going to be an electrician and find out what electricity is really, how it really works. So we're kind of in this point where, actually we're more like 4-year-olds. Let's stay with that one. We did a brief handout, just a single page front and back, with some excerpts from Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled and a couple of other things that we thought would be quite interesting. She quotes some people that we never got a chance to read, and makes some references here that we thought would be of some interest. So we're going to share these and take them. If you wouldn't mind kind of passing around. I know I get it now. Let's see there. Oh, sure. No, got a couple. It's always good to look at words. So besides the definition of theology and of religion, at the top we added a word from the Neoplatonic Academy, theurgy. And we didn't mention it tonight, but it's from the Greek for divine work, theurgos. And the 5th century Athenian philosopher was one who basically was the last one to close the lights on the Athenian Academy, called it a power higher than all human wisdom, embracing the blessings of divination, the purifying powers of initiation, and in a word, all the operations of divine possession. So he speaks as an initiate, as does St. Paul, the very bottom of the second page. HPB actually quotes this a couple of times in this from 1 Corinthians, that Paul says, according to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. The reference is to the master builder, which HPB, and she's quoting others who say this as well, but she agrees pretty strongly that the term master builder, which is only used once in the New Testament, in fact in the entire Bible, is an occult and, well, it is basically a phrase from the mystery schools, because the adepts were called master builders. They were the ones that not only had a functioning knowledge of their own natures and of great nature, but could also initiate others. And so amongst all the early Christians, Paul is given credit for being amongst that group that spoke about things that they knew about. Not in the sense of divulging mysteries they weren't allowed to, but simply of speaking about these kinds of ideas to plant seeds for others to follow. And this was the best of the Christian tradition. This was of course, first, early, 2nd century, and what we know of Paul as a person has been filtered by way too much ologies. But it certainly gives an idea of the ancient world and how little of it we really know, and what a great debt we owe to HPB for showing us a lot of, or lifting one corner at least of that veil of nature, the veil of Isis, and how this philosophy was seen in the ancient world, and how we can look at it again with fresh eyes. Our time is up. Next week, January the 4th, if I have the correct one, here it is. Next Sunday, the fire of mind. Right up this alley. Thank you all.